we really are now moving into the phase, I think, of where we're going to be in the long haul, politically and economically, as well as militarily. Um, and I'd say that even as Ukraine is hitting back, they're carrying out their own airstrikes against the Russians. The biggest development, I think, this month so far has been the opening of the accession talks for Ukraine and for its neighbor Moldova to join the European Union. Uh, you might remember that soon after the Russian invasion in 2022, both countries applied to the EU to join. There is a protracted process when you get candidacy status as to whether you meet the conditions to proceed into negotiations. Uh, Ukraine and Moldova, both in terms of anti corruption legislation, good governance, judicial reform, whole series of conditions. And now the EU has said, yeah, we're ready for the negotiations to start, which they did on the 25th in Luxembourg.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're talking about the latest on the war in Ukraine, and I'm delighted to be joined by one of our regular guests here on Frontline, Professor Scott Lucas from the Clinton Institute at University College Dublin. Scott, always a pleasure. Welcome back.
Hey, thank you for letting me sneak back in, James.
To begin with, give us your assessment on where we are in this conflict at the moment as we enter July 2024.
James, I think we're in it for the long haul. This is now going into the 29th month of the Russian invasion, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. It's now over 10 years since Russia tried to split off part of the country after the Maidan Revolution of 2014 removed the pro-Russian leader, Viktor Yanukovych. So, it's not going to be like a dramatic end with a breakthrough on the battlefield front lines. It's about a year since Ukraine launched its big offensive that petered out in the east and in the south. But more importantly, I think the Russian offensive that we've watched since the start of the year uh, it's gained a few villages in the east, but the Kharkiv offensive, which we were talking about a month ago, the cross-border offensive, that has now pretty much stalled out. And while the Russians are occupying a few more villages in Donetsk, they haven't had a big breakthrough. For example, Hasiv Yar, which was a strategic town that they've been assaulting for months because it occupies the high ground to the west of Russian-occupied Donetsk. They haven't been able to take it yet. And I think failing a Russian breakthrough like that on the front line, we're sort of in a loop right now about the Russians keep saying, we're going to get you, we're going to get you. And Ukraine saying to the West, make sure that you've got our backs, that you've got it bolstered. I think there's a second front, which is the air war that the Russians are launching. And what has changed that this year has been the guided bombs. And what the Russians are doing is they put their aircraft over their territory. They fire from there with these guided bombs that, quote, precision weapons. If they're precision weapons, they're being used on civilian targets by and large, especially on Kharkiv city. And Vladimir Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, said yesterday more than 800 fired in the last month. So it's that Russian effort, to damage energy infrastructure, but to break civilian resistance on a day after day basis. And again, the question is not that the Russians, I think, will break Ukraine's resistance on it, but can they break the international community from supporting Ukraine? Which actually brings me, I think, to the most important front, the wider front. And that is, we really are now moving into the phase, I think, of where we're going to be in the long haul, politically and economically, as well as militarily. And I'd say that even as Ukraine is hitting back, they're carrying out their own airstrikes against the Russians. The biggest development, I think, this month so far has been the opening of the accession talks for Ukraine and for its neighbor Moldova to join the European Union. You might remember that soon after the Russian invasion in 2022, both countries applied to the EU to join. There is a protracted process when you get candidacy status as to whether you meet the conditions to proceed into negotiations. Ukraine and Moldova, both in terms of anti corruption legislation, good governance, judicial reform, whole series of conditions. And now the EU has said, yeah, we're ready for the negotiations to start, which they did on the 25th in Luxembourg. Now, these won't be quick, these will take some time. but I do think we are in the position where, you could well see Ukraine and Moldova, even as Russia occupies parts of both of those countries, coming into the EU as the 28th and 29th members, which it's a loose parallel. I stress a loose parallel because I hope it won't last for 40 years. But in the Cold War, your viewers and listeners will remember that there was a divided Germany, that as, the Russian-backed East German government clamped down on the population, West Germany joined NATO. West Germany, of course, would be one of the founding members of the European Union. Uh, it was to serve as an example to those in the East. Look, this is what you can do economically and politically. And eventually, the story that in 1989, the East German system collapsed, and eventually Germany was reunited 2, 3 years later. Now, like I said, it's a loose parallel because I hope it's not 40 years before the Russian occupation of Ukraine is ended. But the general approach, which is even during military conflict, that you show a country which is economically and politically resilient and it's part of a larger bloc, a larger group, I think that's where we're heading.
And surely that speaks to the fact that for all the tactical gains Russia has made this year on the ground in Ukraine, from a strategic perspective, Vladimir Putin has failed spectacularly in some of his big goals because he wanted to undermine any sense of Ukrainian sovereignty and national identity. And the fact that we're now talking about accession talks to the EU, if anything, he has fostered a greater sense of Ukrainian national sovereignty and identity than ever before.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, let's knock something on the head because it's a whole bunch of guff from those who excuse Putin's invasion, indeed sometimes support it. And I'm talking about activists and even some academics in the UK, in Europe, in the US. And that is, oh, this was NATO that caused the war. This was NATO that provoked Putin into doing this because Ukraine was going to become a member of NATO. No, it wasn't. In 2022, there was absolutely no prospect of Ukraine joining NATO. Uh, the talks, which had been sort of in principle, mentioned in 2008, they had long been set aside. There was no prospect of NATO joining the European Union at that point. And here we go. Just as Putin led to Sweden and Finland joining NATO, just as it led to a European Union commitment to Ukraine generally, now he is fostering that process that he supposedly was trying to stop. He may still stop it. We'll get on to talk about Donald Trump in a few minutes, I suspect. But at this point, no. I find myself on a day-to-day basis and understand why that people will look at every small development on the battlefield, and especially if they fall for Kremlin propaganda and say, "Oh, Ukraine can't hang on, Ukraine can't hang on," and we're now talking about a much wider conflict here. We're talking about the battle for a secure Ukraine politically and economically. And I think if it does join the EU, and if in effect it's working with NATO, even if it doesn't become a NATO member, that's probably far more secure in the longer run than it was in 2014 when Russia started trying to break it apart.
You mentioned Donald Trump a moment ago, Scott. Let's touch on him because throughout, people have speculated that one of Vladimir Putin's strategies is to sit and wait and hope that Trump returns to the White House in November. And let's be honest, speaking at the moment, as we enter July 2024, that looks increasingly likely, particularly given President Biden's pretty disastrous debate performance last week that may further damage his chances. What is your sense of the political situation in the US?
Um, I probably we need for a separate front line, but I'll leave that to talk about uh, what is now, I think, the nightmare becoming reality in the U.S. And I'll cut to the chase. I think if Joe Biden persists in the candidacy for November, I think he is such a frail candidate that it opens the door for Trump to get back into the White House, despite the fact, and I'll say this, and I always say this for listeners, let us remind ourselves that Donald Trump is a convicted felon. He is a convicted sex offender. He is a convicted fraudster. He is a man who attempted a coup in 2021 to hold on to the presidency illegally. He is a serial liar, and he is a friend of Vladimir Putin. because to cut to the chase in that debate, and if it was overshadowed because of Biden's poor performance, but Trump repeated that if he becomes president, Ukraine does not get another dollar of aid from the U.S. And again, your viewers and listeners will remember in 2019, Donald Trump blackmailed Ukraine, even as Russia was, through hybrid warfare, trying to break Ukraine. Donald Trump froze military aid because Ukraine would not dish dirt on Joe Biden at that point. So this is a man who, from a personal point of view, thinks that Ukraine, specifically the Zelensky government, did not help him. This is a man who has this crude idea that if any country gets assistance from the United States, it is ripping America off. He said that about Japan, getting him, an American ally. He said it about South Korea. He said it about NATO. Why wouldn't he say it about Ukraine? So let's be very, very clear here that for months, the European Union and other countries have been making contingency plans for Trump coming in. This is one reason why it was vital for the European Union to adopt the 50 billion euro fund for financial support of Ukraine, which was adopted in the spring. This is why it was vital for the U.S. Congress to pass the $60 billion military aid package back in April. Those contingency plans, again, if Biden persists in running, are probably going to have to be activated. And I think even if Biden's replaced by another Democratic candidate, I think it's now an uphill battle to keep Trump from getting back into the White House. And rest assured that there will be discussions going on privately. It will not be floated publicly because you don't want to say the game is up. But across Europe and indeed Australia, China, Japan, and other countries, they're all making plans for what to do to support Ukraine if the Trump administration takes America onto the sidelines.
Well, let's just look ahead to that potential scenario. Let's say Trump does win. Let's say he cuts off all future US military aid to Ukraine. I mean, you're going to have a huge ramping up of assistance, as you say, from the EU, from Britain, Australia, South Korea, potentially Japan, etc. Is there the political will for that? I mean, we've had elections over the weekend in France with the populist right doing extraordinarily well there, and questions over what their position to Ukraine would be. So is there the will in Europe and elsewhere to increase support to the levels that would be required?
Let me say one thing on the U.S. front before we move away from that, and that is that it's really important to recognize that a lot of this is in terms of what U.S. agencies do. Even if the headline is that Congress doesn't adopt any more aid immediately, U.S. military logistical assistance, intelligence provision is still going to be vital. The U.S. State Department providing diplomatic assistance is vital. The U.S. Treasury working with, for example, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the EU, for example, even if the U.S. doesn't provide aid, working with others in terms of the most effective way to provide aid. Now, that does not substitute for all out American support. So you talk about what the other countries do. It's going to be a heavy lift, to say the least, because you're trying to replace what would be billions of dollars in American aid. But do remember that the largest provider of assistance to Ukraine to date has not been the United States. The largest provider of aid to Ukraine has been the European Union. And of course, if you talk about constituent members within the EU, right, such as the Germans, who've been the second largest provider of military aid, then it becomes important. Remember that when it comes, for example, to F-16s, U.S.-made F-16s, that those are not being provided by the Americans. Those are being provided by countries who have U.S. F-16s. And so that's what we're talking about. We have to keep an eye in terms of a sort of a revamped effort in terms of what takes place. And I'll also mention, I know every pro-Kremlin person is going to jump on this on YouTube, so let them come and do it. CIA also has ways to provide covert assistance to Ukraine. Now, you have to talk about how that's done. It's done through secret budgets, but it's something that is there. Not, again, to the level of what the Pentagon can provide in assistance, but the CIA can do it. And by the way, as a caveat, that doesn't mean the CIA is running the war in Ukraine. For all you Kremlin groupies out there, it just means that, in terms of providing what is vital in terms of Ukrainian defense against Russia, yeah, there's still some covert assistance that can be put out.
And in terms of, what we're seeing in France and the rise of the AfD,
Yeah,
for instance, in
yeah,
Germany and other populist parties, I mean, how big a worry is that for you,
yeah.
Scott?
Sorry, yeah, I apologize. That's the question I should have been answering.
No, that was fascinating, and that was really interesting background. But yeah, I mean, there's
Yeah,
the
yeah.
dual
Now,
challenge.
let's talk about France right now because it's in the headlines because of the first round of elections that took place yesterday. By the way, an important caveat here is it's only the first round of the French elections, recognizing that we're in new territory in that the National Rally, Rassemblement National, the far right party, formerly a neo-Nazi party, uh, took the largest share of the vote. You've got to go through the second round of the National Assembly elections to see how many seats they eventually get. And that's going to turn upon whether the other two main blocs, which are the left wing Popular Front and Emmanuel Macron's centrist bloc, whether they unite against the right wing. But being that as it may, let's say that the largest party in the National Assembly is Marine Le Pen's party, and let's even say that Jordan Bardella becomes prime minister. Le Pen and Bardella have said they will continue to support Ukraine. They have not taken the Viktor Orban line in Hungary. They have not taken the AfD line, right? And indeed, they've distanced themselves from the AfD in Germany. So we would have to see what happens if they were in power in France, whether they would stick to that. But at this point, believe it, a hard right victory in France does not take France off the table in terms of supporting Ukraine. The AfD in Germany did not actually do as well as was anticipated in the European elections last month. A lot of people miss this because the whole idea is far right surge, which was kind of misleading. The AfD still took 15% of the vote, but they were projected to take more than 20. And what was key here is that the center right party, the CDU, the Christian Democrats, they actually were the ones that did the best in that uh, election. So even if Olaf Scholz, who is center left, even if he is weakened as a chancellor, the German system is not in terms of providing support for Ukraine that takes place. And the big development is that the real threat to Europe supporting Ukraine, of course, had been Hungary, who, by the way, takes the presidency of the European Union for 6 months today. But what we've seen is that Viktor Orban will push in terms of threatening to hold up European Union aid, to threaten the accession talks with Ukraine, and then he'll pull back. He will pull back from the brink of forcing a showdown with the EU. And the working arrangement now is that as long as Hungary stays on the sidelines in terms of what NATO does, as long as Hungary stays on the sidelines of what the EU does, they can be president for 6 months, but they don't get in the way of the initiatives that are taking place right now in terms of providing the political, economic, military support. Yeah, one other thing about it, and it's a little one, most people wouldn't notice. There was a big deal about Slovakia when a guy named Robert Fico became prime minister last autumn because it was going to be like, oh, he's just like Viktor Orban. Slovakia has a government is not providing military assistance to Ukraine, but it is said and repeated this past week that it is okay for private groups in Slovakia to provide military assistance. So even Slovakia is not taking as hard a line in reality as in public. And similarly, Serbia, which was seen as being very much its president being sympathetic to Putin, Alexander Vucic, has actually said that they have no problem with Serbian arms going through other countries and being provided to Ukraine.
And we should probably just note, just by way of marking the card for our international viewers, that probably this time next week there'll be a new government in the UK. Although in the UK there is cross-party consensus when it comes to support for Ukraine. But just to note that. Yeah. In terms of the situation in the US, I mean, one of the questions I have, Scott, is, well, if Biden is going to see out his term at the very least, whether he runs again in November, who knows? Surely it's in his interest to do everything he can to ramp up support for Ukraine now. Now, I appreciate there are hurdles in terms of passing new aid bills through Congress because of the Republicans' reluctance to do so in some cases. But, things like placing restrictions on where Ukraine can use long-range weapons inside Russian territory.
Yeah.
It still is surprising to me that there are such restrictions.
Yeah, and it's a little bit surprising to me, and it's especially, well, if not surprising, disconcerting for Vladimir Zelensky. Um, all I can tell you is that from while the Americans have provided, the Biden administration has provided essential assistance to Ukraine throughout this invasion, they have always been hesitant as to how far they gave support to Ukraine in terms of the idea that it would provoke a greater Russian response in retaliation. Your folks who have got long memories will remember that this was the issue behind providing tanks to Ukraine uh, all the way back in 2022. They'll know that it delayed making any arrangements for trying to provide warplanes like the F-16s, which of course we finally expect will be delivered later this year, but could have been delivered much sooner because the Americans were worried that Russia would, jack up, as it were, the threats of strikes not only on Ukraine but on other countries as well. And we're in the iteration where the Americans are worried that if Ukraine uses long-range American missiles, which were finally provided in April, the ATACMS missiles, which have a range of 300 kilometers, then that would uh, that would provoke the Russians again, who thump their chest. We've got nuclear weapons. We've got our own missiles. We could do this. We could do that. In reality, if you use the U.S. long-range missiles on Russian positions in Crimea, which I suspect is where we're going, and if you use British and French Storm Shadow and Scout missiles on Russian positions, um, then I don't think that this is as it were, a position that collapses. I think the immediate problem that we had is that the Americans were not even letting Ukraine hit uh, Russian firing positions that were being used to support the cross-border offensives, and they finally have relaxed that. We are going to, I think, get to a point in terms of, and this is what Zelensky highlighted yesterday, if you paid a lot of attention to what he said, because he mentioned those 800 glide bombs that the Russians have fired in the past month. And what he said is, you've got to hit the Russian launching positions and you've got to hit Russian warplanes. And I think that's where the rubber is going to hit the road. Because if you fire on a Russian warplane, which is over Russian territory, is that an expansion of the war, which is unacceptable? And of course, once Ukraine gets F-16s, when can the F-16s engage Russian warplanes? And I'm just going to say that you can see why the Americans might be hesitant about that. Um, but what you've got is that the Kremlin is operating in a position of sanctuary here. That as long as you don't start to think about how you can engage those military positions that are continuing to fire on Ukraine and so on, Putin knows he's got a free pass for some of those attacks that are going to be carried, especially in the eastern Ukraine, not the southern front as much, because that's coming from Crimea and from the Black Sea. But in eastern Ukraine, that's the place where he sort of gets a little bit of free reign because of the American restrictions so far.
You mentioned Crimea a moment ago. Is it your view, Scott, that really Ukraine winning this war comes down to what happens in Crimea, whether it's destroying the Kerch Bridge, whether it's making significant inroads into Crimea? Do you think Crimea holds the key?
First of all, when we talk about winning this war, we need to deal with something here that almost everybody, I think, a lot of people are getting this wrong. And that is, you're not going to see this war being won with a battlefield victory, not at least in the near future, right? Um, so when you talk about Ukraine hitting Crimea, remember that Ukraine's already damaged or destroyed 1/3 of Russia's Black Sea fleet, and that much of the Black Sea fleet has been withdrawn back to Russia. So Ukraine, in a sense, has already won in the sense that it has defended itself against that naval threat. And indeed, I think the last Russian warship that could fire missiles, that was missile capable, was actually damaged beyond repair a few weeks ago. If you talk about what Ukraine has done with the ability to degrade Russia, not completely remove their military capability, but degrade Crimea, yes, that's happened. But that primarily safeguards southern Ukraine, if you think about it, the areas that border that take place. So we're not talking about a battlefield victory at this point. What we're doing is we're actually drawing lines against how far the Russians can press their campaign if it takes it. So what does winning look like? And this returns us to an earlier point in the discussion. Ukraine has never thought that it was going to be able to get Crimea back, which of course Russia annexed in 2014. So if you go back to the Ukrainian proposal that they made back in April of 22, their proposal in April of 22, and by the way, folks, again, to knock back a Kremlin talking point, these talks were not scuppered because Boris Johnson went to Kyiv and told Ukraine, you can't negotiate with the Russians. They were scuppered because Russia put unacceptable conditions down. But Ukraine's position was, we have a 10 to 15 year cooling off period in Crimea, and then we put it to the people of Crimea as to what they want their status to be. And I think that's where we still are. That Crimea is in this limbo. What you're really talking about are the four regions that Vladimir Putin wanted to annex. 2 in the south, Zaporizhia, Kherson, 2 in the east, Donetsk, Luhansk. Will Russia be allowed to establish long-term occupation of those areas, effectively partitioning Ukraine? And what winning constitutes in this is not that you defeat the Russians militarily in those areas, but that you do not surrender and accept the long-term Russian occupation, right? Which is precisely what the Kremlin wants. Every time the Kremlin says peace negotiations, that's what they want. What they're saying is, we want to demilitarize Ukraine, and we want those 4 regions of Ukraine to be that. And if you ever have anyone give way to those negotiations, whether or not they're just being naive or deceptive, that's when you lose effectively. So what do? You keep the political, economic options open. So you build up Ukraine in the areas that are beyond those 4 regions. You support Ukraine in those 4 regions, and you do not give way on the long-term status of those areas that Putin tried to seize when his all-out invasion failed to take Kyiv.
Professor Scott Lucas, we always appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us today on Frontline.
Thank you, James.
Thank you for watching Frontline for Times Radio. For more on global security and the war in Ukraine, you can listen to Times Radio, take out a digital subscription to the Times, and click subscribe on our YouTube channel.